Next up, we're going to look at how to create a texture from scratch within Substance Painter, and we'll be using mostly these grunges and procedurals, and of course you can import your own textures. Now, Substance has Designer, which is what's really made for kind of creating materials from scratch, and then it also has Alchemist, which is meant to combine materials so that you can make new materials from there or to make them from bitmaps. Substance Painter is meant more to apply those materials to your objects, but there are enough tools here that you can create some simple materials within Substance Painter. So we're going to walk you through how to create a stylized wood texture because it's a pretty common texture we're going to be using throughout this kitchen piece. So let's go ahead, we'll go to File, New. We're going to use the cabinets as an example here. So we'll select those cabinets and I'm going to do either a 2K or 4K. So I'll do 4K to make it a little easier for you to see over the recording there. And then what I'm going to do is zoom in here. And I'm going to start by baking my mesh maps. Come up to my texture set and I'm going to bake these mesh maps. And I'm going to set mine to 2K texture and let those bake. Now that that's done, that'll come in useful to us later when we're trying to create more of a smart material later on. So let's go ahead. We're going to delete this kind of default layer that comes with it. We're going to create a fill layer. Let's call this base color, and we'll leave all the channels turned on down here. We'll take this base color and we'll push this to kind of a warmish kind of brown color. That's kind of one. I want kind of like a reddish brown there. And then what we're going to do is with all selected, we can search here and we can search for wood. And we can see here that we have a procedural kind of texture for wood, which will allow us to kind of change things a bit dynamically. So let's create another fill layer and we'll call this one wood grain. And then again, we can leave all these options on. And I'm going to drag our wood material first into the base color and we'll play with it there first. So what we can do here is come up, change this from UV projection to triplanar projection. Now for these cabinets, I just used a quick automatic UV unwrap. So the UVs on them aren't necessarily the greatest for wood direction. And we'll discuss how to kind of get around that later. I did that intentionally for people using automatic UV unwrap so that we could kind of show some problem solving. So let's go ahead. Let's scale this down to say 3, looks pretty good. And I think this wood has a bit too many knots in it. And that's the great thing about these procedural textures is we can go ahead and adjust things like that. So we can take these knots here and let's say we go down to 0.25 and that's looking a lot more natural to me. I might even try 0.1. And there we go. So now what we're going to do is change the blending mode up here. And you can play with different blending modes, but I'm just trying to get this to blend kind of over our base color a bit naturally. I'm going to start with an overlay blending mode, and I'm pretty happy with how that looks. You can also invert it down here if you want. So I can invert that and kind of play with my hardness until I get a result that I like. So I'm going to try invert true and maybe 0.75, and I want a little less hardness than that, so I may just leave that at the default 0.5. Now what we're going to do is add this same texture into the height. So what we can do is come down here, grab this wood texture, put it into the height, and we can leave the hardness at the default, and we can set this height to 0.5, and we can see now that we're getting height information in there. And it looks like the height information is going to be a little intense. Now let's come up here to our base color and change this to height. We can come over here to our height material. You can see that the height's pretty intense and that with wood, we're going to want something very subtle. And do remember that it will convert that height information to normal. So that makes that a lot easier. So let's go ahead and let's just maybe rotate this down to 10%. And that's looking a lot more kind of natural for what I would expect it. And we can see that we have a really glossy kind of roughness here. And we don't want our wood to be quite that shiny. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down to the roughness. And again, we're going to input our wood into the roughness there. And we can come down here to our roughness pass and see that, again, that's a pretty kind of intense roughness pattern. So we can go ahead and we'll leave this again at 0.5 and we'll change our knots back to 0.1 so that they match up. And then again, we can come up here, we can change to the roughness pass and we can kind of drive that down just a bit. So let's say that we only want our wood to be about 10% kind of variation there. And now it's going to be blending with the roughness beneath it more. So let's go ahead, rotate our light there. And what we can do is come down to the base color, come down to the roughness here, and we can see that our roughness is actually pretty shiny. So we're just gonna kind of bump that up. I'm gonna put mine around 0.5 to start and see how that looks. And that's still a little bit shinier than I want for the wood. So what I'll do is put this at 0.75. And I'm going to kind of meet in between, so we'll do 0.6. Of course, there's no right or wrong way to do this. If you want your wood to be glossier, you can, of course, do that. So let's come back up to the wood grain, and we can see here that the blacks here are kind of intense. So we can come up to our base color, and you can play with different blending modes, such as soft light. And I use soft light and multiply and overlay quite a bit. But I'm going to go back to my overlay, and what I'm going to do is just kind of, again, lower that opacity. So I'm going to just play with that until it's not quite so intense. So it looks like around 50 looks pretty good here. And there we can kind of see that we're starting to get some variation in our wood grain color without kind of like those intense deep blacks. So then now what we can do is come back to the height, and it still seems that our height is a bit intense. And if you turn that all the way off, you can see how much it's affecting it. So let's go ahead and maybe only put that up to about 5, and that'll kind of help soften that effect a bit.